Welcome, everybody. While we're going to give a couple more minutes for folks to join on. While we're waiting, you're welcome to type in the chat where you're joining us from tonight. Welcome to those who are just joining us. While we are waiting for folks to sign on, you're welcome to type in the chat where you're joining us from tonight. Awesome to see there's lots of folks who are joining all over Long Island, California, New York City. So we're going to wait another minute for folks to join on while we're waiting for folks who just joined. You are welcome to type in the chat where you're joining us from. Awesome to see there's folks from all over. Eddie from the Bronx. Eddie. Los Angeles, all over. Great. So I'll get started on a couple of housekeeping announcements and then pass it over to Olivia to get us started. Regarding sort of housekeeping Zoom announcements, closed captioning is available for today's program. To access that, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. In addition, if you'd like to rename yourself, add your pronouns, you can do so by clicking participants and then clicking the ellipsis, the ... next to your name. And then finally, this is not a CE program, so you won't, you won't be able to get continuing education credits for attending today's program. However, it will be recorded, and if you would like to watch the recording or send the recording to folks, it will be on our YouTube page. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Olivia to get us started with some ground rules.
Great. Thank you so much, Nell. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm just going to give out some grounding rules before we begin. So my name's Olivia. I'm the policy coordinator here at NASW New York State. And the first grounding that I want to share is that this meeting is for BIPOC individuals to share their stories and unmute and participate via the discussion in the Zoom, and we ask that our white allies participate via the chat function and focusing on listening. Listening is a form of participation. This is a space of discomfort, and we are learning how to engage in dialogue and embrace the discomfort that comes with these vulnerable conversations. I also want to encourage participants to take care of themselves as you see fit. If you would like to provide mental health resources specifically for BIPOC individuals, that would be lovely. Please feel free to drop some links in the chat, and we can absolutely get those posted onto our website as a resource. I also want to reiterate confidentiality in these meetings. Please refrain from sharing any identifying information about names of agencies, supervisors, or colleagues, and of course, clients to protect yourself and others. And lastly, conversations that are had here, things that are said might offend people, but this is a brave space to have these conversations. The point is to not offend anyone, but tensions will arise. It's how we react. You need to understand your own triggers and understand that discomfort is growth. So now I'll pass it over to Fatoumata to read out some additional principles of our community.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I am Fatoumata, the policy team intern. So some of the principles of our community, aka ground rules, we recognize that we must strive to overcome historical and divisive biases such as racism and sexism in our society. We acknowledge that we're all systematically taught misinformation about our own groups and about members of other groups. This is true for everyone, regardless of our groups. We agree not to blame ourselves or others for the misinformation we have learned, but to accept responsibility for not repeating misinformation after we have learned otherwise. We agree to listen respectfully to each other without interruptions. Only one person speaks at a time. However, this does not mean we should ignore problematic statements. See information here on calling in and calling out. Both approaches are valid and can be done with care and respect, with the goal of helping each other learn. We agree that we may be at different stages of learning on the content and discussion topics. We agree that no one should be required or expected to speak for their whole race or gender. We can't even if we wanted to. Everyone has to come to the table to learn, grow, and share. We will trust that people are doing the best that they can. We all make mistakes and have bad days. When these occur, let's challenge and encourage each other to do better. We acknowledge once again that we may be at different stages of learning on the topic. Share responsibly for including all voices in the discussion. If you have a tendency to dominate discussions, please take a step back and help the group invite others to speak. If you tend to stay quiet, challenge yourself to share ideas so others can learn from you. If you're exceedingly quiet, do expect that the facilitator will call on you in meetings to participate. We are not experts, we're experienced facilitators, but do not claim to be experts. We're here to help facilitate the process along with everyone in the group. We are here to learn. We also recognize that everyone has an opinion. Opinions, however, are not the same as informed knowledge backed up by research. Depending on the topic and context, both are valid to share, but it's important to know the difference. To engage in deep learning, we will want to learn more towards informed knowledge and gain practice reflecting and speaking thoughtfully on difficult topics. Ask for help. It's okay not to know. Keep in mind that we are all still learning and are bound to make mistakes when approaching a complex task or exploring new ideas. Be open to changing your mind and make space for others to do so as well.
Thank you so much, Fatimata. So before we begin our discussion questions for tonight, I'm just going to invite our other facilitators to unmute and introduce yourselves.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Cecily, and I have to, in full transparency, I'm losing my voice because I had a chest cold, so my voice is a little shot. So I'm going to be on the quieter side this evening, but I'm still here, fully present, and will support as much as I can. And obviously, I'm so grateful to be part of this space. I used to be part of town halls all the time, and then I took a step back to attend to some other things, and I'm really, really excited and grateful to be here and to see all of you and to be part of this, what I think is going to be an amazing, really rich discussion. So thank you. Okay, I think it's just the two of us, Olivia, or is it someone else who's also facilitating?
Yeah, I don't know if Alicia is able to unmute. I think she's in transit, but Alicia will be joining us when she's able to. Alicia is another one of our policy team interns from this past year, another lovely facilitator, so hopefully she can unmute and introduce herself a little bit later. All right, so our first question to begin the conversation. So tonight is all about finding and sustaining joy in social work activism. So we wanted to know, how do you find and sustain joy in social work activism, if at all? And BIPOC individuals, please feel free to unmute, and white allies, we ask that you participate through the chat functions. Great, I see someone put into the chat, attending NASW California lobbying days. That's awesome. it's definitely, it brings me joy being together just in a group of like-minded people, all advocating for, you know, our priorities. So I definitely agree with that.
Good afternoon, hailing from Los Angeles, California, City of Angels. What I usually do that brings me joy is there have a small group of people on Facebook and also on chat where we talk about historical things that people of color have done in this country that's being ignored. Like, for example, we was talking about Seneca Village, which was by eminent domain taken over and renamed Central Park. And we also was talking about there was a particular place that was it was owned by a Black couple in Southern California, and then the city took over, Manhattan Beach took over, and then it was restored to the Black family. But since they did not have the legal expertise to hang on to it, they allowed it to be sold back to the city of Manhattan Beach for a couple of $1 million. So therefore, lots of years was wasted getting it back into the hands of people of color.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. It sounds like, you know, you're kind of reclaiming the history or sharing the pieces of Black history that aren't as popular or as well known in your city.
I can go. I think for me, I don't know. I feel like all I do like relates to like social services in some way, social justice. But I think what really energizes me is not doing social justice work. Like, you know, definitely being intentional about the work I am doing, but also being intentional of like the free time I have, like making sure I get time to sleep, making sure I'm doing things that, you know, of course, you know, that don't in some way have to do with like reliving trauma or dealing with social issues that I deal with on the daily. So if that means like going to watch a movie, if that means having like a fun day with family, I tend to like those things and do those things more just because I'm always thinking and I'm always in a meeting or involved with something. So just being a part of something that doesn't make me think about it on a conscious level just lets me regain the energy and like the love that I have for it when I do come back to the work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing. Sometimes all we need is just to unplug from the work for a little bit and kind of gain that energy back.
Can I just, and I'm gonna try not to talk too much. This is gonna be hard for me. But Frederick, is that how you pronounce your name?
Frederick.
Frederick, thank you so much for sharing. And I'm snapping and I like put a heart because I can so resonate. And I think what you just said is so important in terms of intentionality, right? Intentionality about how and when we show up and do what we do, and also knowing when we need to take a step back. So that's such an important piece. And everybody has to find their own balance, right? But I really, really appreciate what you shared. And that so resonates with my own story and my own process. So thank you so much.
Does anyone here have a hard time recognizing or finding joy in activism? I know it can be very exhausting work, especially if you are part of the community that you're advocating for. So I've definitely experienced, I'll call it burnout within myself, kind of recognizing that if I'm doing this 24/7, eventually my engine's gonna shut down. And that leads me to finding, it's not really joyful doing the work. It's more so like the pressure to do the work. And that's when I don't find it enjoying.
I think that's where I'm at. I've been doing activism work nonstop, but I think I've come to a point where I'm seeing things very differently. As I look back at being an Indigenous person and how a lot of the liberatory kind of movements are really just perpetuating Native genocide, settler colonialism. We talked about Seneca Village earlier, but it's never mentioned that this is still Lenape land that's been stolen. We talk about the beach front that was sold back, but we never talk about the fact that that was never that land to sell in the first place. And I think that the epigenetic ignorance of a lot of people who use Indigenous peoples as props to move their liberation forward at the expense of ours. We talk about, not wanting capitalism, but so many people thinking that liberation is only through wealth. That's one example, and so I think that for me, where I'm at is that my joy in doing this work has just become rage, because I understand that at the end of the day, people don't give a shit about Indigenous people, not just here on Turtle Island, but everywhere. Because indigeneity is not just something that is framed as the people here on this continent. We talk about it in this way because this is the experience and context. But we also have to talk about Indigenous peoples in Polynesia, on the continent of Africa, in all of these places where settler colonial violence is continuing to happen, but the only thing people are actually fighting for is privilege and access to settler colonial power. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Eddie. I think rage is a very common experience, especially when you're advocating on behalf of your community. And oftentimes, larger corporations come in and kind of take the work that your community is doing and kind of slap a label on it and call it theirs. And that part is even more so frustrating. So how do you stay true to your values in activism? Especially when maybe it involves individuals or corporations taking the work you're doing. How do you stay true to your values in activism?
I think for me, it's remembering the why. Like as Pride is about to start, we know that all these corporations only like gay people when they can pocket off of us. The performative activism, even in thinking about how in many ways, as Black liberatory movements have become more commercialized, as corporate entities, Black Lives Matter is now a corporate entity with a board, with all of these, powers that have started to be used almost as a product, which then minimizes the grassroots movement of all of this. And so I think that for me, it's remembering the why. So from a queer context, Pride was a riot. And I'm open to violence any day of the week. So it's always taking it back to that, because a lot of the corporate entities just want to sterilize the roots of the activism to make it more palatable and commercial for the masses. And so I think that constantly reclaiming that narrative and taking it away from the dollars, taking it away from the people who co-opt these things is what has to be done.
Absolutely. That was beautifully said. Thank you so much.
Yes, I
Remembering those
agree. I was also gonna say like remembering the why and like having like daily check-ins or like making sure like I'm a part of spaces like this. I feel like this is a very privileged space because it's like a lot of the time we find ourselves doing this work alone or with like smaller groups. So just being a part of spaces where I get to talk to other individuals doing the work, being reminded that there are other people invested, other people who know what's going on, other people who have the similar wants and like goals that I do, just keeps me on track, right? Because there's definitely a lot of moments where it's like, oh, this feels like useless or like nothing's really changing. Like I'm doing all this work and I don't see like kind of like the fruits of the labor, right? So like being in spaces like this and having conversations, I think that's kind of how I keep myself going, right? Because I know there's other people also doing this work.
Yeah, it's so important to kind of reground yourself in this work. Like you said, you don't really see the fruits of your labor too quick in activism. You know, this change takes time, policy work takes time. So that's a great reminder, kind of staying true to yourself and grounding yourself in the spaces where you can be surrounded with, you know, common-minded folks.
So I actually feed off of these kind of groups because a lot of times somebody will say something like, for example, Eddie said something that's very powerful about it's true, but he actually said a quiet part out loud when he was talking about corporations really don't give a damn about um, LGBTQ individuals unless there's a dollar sign next to it. Was the same thing with people of color. Now, how many people remember going back a couple of years, definitely dating myself to with the Cheerios commercial, the first interracial Cheerio commercial where they had the white mother and the biracial daughter talking about just about Cheerios good for your heart, and the husband, the black husband, woke up to a whole bunch of Cheerios on his heart, and he says, "Jan," and the outrage by a certain group of people, who shall remain nameless, was so severe that Cheerios caved momentarily and removed that commercial off of the airways. But I think with the support of people which way outnumbered the bigots, wrote in the Cheerios saying, "Why did you remove the commercial? It was such a good commercial." That they, not only did they bring it back, but he kind of stuck a knife in the eye of the bigots by having the Super Bowl commercial where the white woman was actually pregnant with another child. And then they brought the child in and says, "Okay, you got mommy, you got daddy, you got me, and we're gonna have another baby." And then the girl says, "And a puppy." I thought that was hilarious.
Thank you so much for sharing, Robert.
I think to Robert's point, oh, sorry, no, go ahead. I don't want to dominate. Go ahead, Alicia.
Thank you, Eddie. I was just going to say that I think that it is difficult because there's so many things that you can kind of get distracted by. But one thing that has helped me is like having people who know you outside of the work who can always like check you, you know, when you're doing something that's outside of who you are. And, you know, your why, yes, but also just reminding you of you, you know what I'm saying? And kind of getting back to that. For me, like that's my husband, like my best friends, people that have known me since before, you know, I was any of the things, you know? So I think it's definitely helpful because then they can pull your coattails like, hey, you're getting a little too insert adjective here, and kind of bring you back in, you know, whenever you're kind of veering a little bit to the left.
That's a great point. Thank you so much for sharing, Alicia. I think community is very important in this work, and that's what keeps me grounded.
So for me, it really just means being authentic, being true to myself, knowing my values, and like other people said, remembering the reason why I wanted to do it in the first place. And if that means being vulnerable around people, at least, you know, I'll be true to myself and fighting for what I believe in.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think it's really easy to get lost in this work too and kind of lose yourself in the moment. So thank you for sharing that.
For me, I guess it's kind of like a puzzle, just fitting in the pieces. So like recently I switched therapists and I actually feel really good about it because they're a policy oriented social worker and like they understand my BIPOC background and also they're part of the LGBTQ community as well. So like I've only seen them probably like 3 times so far, but it's all been like very productive sessions and where, you know, like this is my therapist, but I can tell that they also see me as a colleague as well and have a level of respect for me where we're able to share our thoughts regarding, you know, the systems that be.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that area.
Absolutely.
So my next question focuses more on community. How do you stay connected with the community throughout the ups and downs of an activism or an activist movement?
I think it's about peeling back the layers constantly and understanding that activism is a living, breathing entity and that the connections to colonial violence that each group has is different.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say something before, but it actually fits way better under this context. And I think that that's because it was kind of to like Robert's point earlier, and then it connected to, I think, Ariel. And the one thing that I noticed that I think that we as a collective have to be very cautious of is the way that language, we always talk about how language is important. And we talk about cultural competence. And I think that in many ways, we have to be connected to each other by understanding the cultural competence of colonialism. We're so invested in being culturally competent in our own oppressions that we do not like continually pay attention to how colonial violence uses little phrases and catchwords to be, inclusive, you know, within the liberal kind of respectability. Like in the same ways that people of color has been used as an anti-Black reference, BIPOC is so easily being used now as an anti-Indigenous reference. Because everything that BIPOC stands for as an umbrella catch-all is inherently against what Indigenous people want. And so many people speak for us without us ever being at the table. How many grants are there out there that say for BIPOC people? And they're always talking about Indigenous people, but there's not one Indigenous person in the space. And so I think that we have to constantly peel back the layers of our work internally to identify how is it that my connection to colonial violence may be different for another community who I'm supposedly working in conjunction with. And if my liberation kind of infringes on their body sovereignty, on their identity, and how that connection to colonial violence is, that's where I think the lateral violence happens. And that's why we're seeing a lot of infighting, is because everybody is actually fighting for visibility. They're not fighting for like the real shit.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, I don't want a seat at the table. I want to break the legs off so that we can start something new, because a seat at the table never works. It never has, and it never will. So I think that we as a collective have to like really sit in that uncomfortable truth.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eddie. Dropping gems for us. But it's really so true. You know, you can't do the work for the community. You have to work with the community. You can't just come in and kind of dictate what the activism will look like. If that's not what the community agrees with, it's never going to work.
I don't know, but I respectfully disagree with that. And when I'm going to use the person I use for this particular, is the late Saul Lindsay. He was able to get many things done using social activism. For example, there was, I think they was doing racist stuff in Chicago airport, but not hiring BIPOC people. So he did. He had a group of people occupy all the bathrooms at that particular time, and throughout Chicago O'Hare's airport. And when people get off the plane, that's usually the first place they go. Everybody went into a blind panic, and at the end of it, Chicago O'Hare started hiring BIPOC people to work at the airport. Same thing in Boston, whereas they wasn't hiring talented, qualified BIPOC people to be a part of the symphony or ballet and so on and so forth. And Boston is known as Beantown, right? So what Saul Alinsky did is that he had everybody buy tickets, but after they ate a bunch of beans. So it would have been a whole different symphony had they not backed down and start allowing people of color, qualified people of color, to be part of the opera, part of ballet, and so on and so forth. He did the same thing with Eastman Kodak by saying basically the only thing of color in Kodak is the film, but eventually he broke that down, so therefore BIPOC people were able to be employed by Eastman Kodak. So sometimes you have to really push the bar and not be on the sideline, because if you're not at the table, you are in the menu.
I want to push back to your point, Robert, because when you say BIPOC, do you just mean Black? And the reason I ask that is because you brought up film, right? Within film, we have seen, since there have been more movements and more acceptance of including Black visibility within film, we've seen that uptick. Indigenous people are still only 0.1%. So when we're using the terms like BIPOC and people of color to try and say that there is this equitable uprising, that's not the case. And I think that was my earlier point, which is we are continually hiding behind these catchphrases without looking at the actual issue, which is one group is getting a lot more access than another group. And the other groups that are not getting access within certain contexts is what we have to continually reflect on. You know, I think this is also where we start to see the breakages and differences between being a leftist and being a liberal. Liberals love to work with the government. Leftists want this whole thing down because they understand that these policies do not necessarily benefit the group as a whole. You need somebody to oppress. You have to have an oppressive group. And so are we working to change the guards, or are we working to have something different? Because I see a lot of changing the guards happening. I do not see unity, like true unity. You know, people, when we think about a certain experience for Black and Brown people who do not identify as being Indigenous, their idea of the American dream is buying land, getting wealth. But you're not buying land, you're buying stolen property. You're occupying stolen property. And so I think that it is this kind of continual reflection within ourselves that we have to look at and be like, how is this not consistent and congruent? Because if your consciousness is not consistent and congruent, then you're not conscious, you're just narcoleptic.
Ooh, Eddie, listen, you're like my spirit animal. I just want you to know that. There's a lot, right? Like a couple of doors down from me that someone owns and it sits there and it's empty. And I can look it up right now in like the land use thing. And I'm like, well, who said you own that? Where did you get it from? Who gave it to you to own in the first place? And so that's always my question, because the land is supposed to be for the people. And if it's just sitting there and it's empty and it was a building there many, many years ago that burned down, why are they not using it? And because it's private property, HPD and other city agencies can't utilize it to build affordable housing because it's not city-owned property. But somebody owns it, but they're not doing anything with it. That's one. Two, I, with all due respect, hate the term. It's not a term for me as a Black woman, because my experience as a Black woman, as an Afro-Caribbean woman, as a person who has like South Asian, you know, heritage as well, it does not encompass my experience being excluded from other color, like groups of color, or, you know, whatever you call them. It's just not, you know, it's not representative for me. And so I definitely understand, and it does kind of negate the experiences of other people and other groups of color. We've had these conversations now, and Olivia are quite familiar. Like, we've had these conversations all the time, because it's just not, you can't talk about oppression and then talk about, well, my Black experience is more important than your Black experience, or your experience as an Indigenous person, because then there's also under layers beneath that. As a man, your experience is different. As a woman, your experience is different. And so we can't really just have this whole like phrase that talks about everybody. And now it's like, oh, well, we're being inclusive because we're talking about it. No, that's not the same thing.
Thank you so much for that dialogue. I think there's a lot of things going on in the chat, a lot of people agreeing. Anna added that a seat at the table only goes so far because we are still working within the system when we need to dismantle it. Cecily dropped a great quote in there. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. It's a great quote. I remember we had a prior town hall conversation about this, and it was a great conversation. So I encourage everyone to check out our YouTube channel if you'd like to watch that conversation. But I definitely agree, you know, the systems only work for those who it was made for. So I definitely agree with all of the conversation going on here, and I'm learning a lot. So I hope everyone else is too. I want to invite maybe another facilitator, Fatumata, if you'd like to introduce a question that you've been sitting on tonight, please feel free to, or Cecily or Alicia.
Yes, of course. What is the role of self-care in finding and sustaining joy in social work activism? We all know it can get very overwhelming and taking over your life, but how do you find, what is the role of self-care in all of that?
In my opinion, and hopefully I'm not hoarding the mic too much, I think for me, the role of self-care is to guard against burnout, not really giving a damn about the clients who I serve. So I learned when I first started working, I'm not going to ramble, I promise. When I first started working with my current employer, I was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and basically working on something I did not finish the prior day, but I started to find myself going way toward burnout only after a couple months on the job. So I learned to set my boundaries hard and fast without any kind of exception, unless a person died, of course, is turn off my phone after I clock out, turn off my computer at the end of the day, because chances are if somebody calls after that, there's a message from the call 988 if they're feeling suicidal, and 911 if it's any kind of problem, and you're not going to be able to help them anyway. So therefore, I leave the message there for them, and I turn my phone off. I always set aside some time to do something that's totally unrelated to work. Now, for me, which makes me a stronger social worker, I think, is watching, especially with the population I work with, is watching movies, various wars that we participated in. So therefore, I'm a knowledgeable person when I'm talking to my client about a particular thing. Oh yeah, I remember watching that on the History Channel or the Smithsonian Channel, so on and so forth. And there's one thing I'm gonna say, and I'm gonna shut up at this point, is that I had a particular client who was in Germany during the 1980s. And I asked him what his MOS was, and he told me what it was. And then he said he was part of Germany. I asked him, is there anywhere near the Fall of the Gap? His response was, how the hell do you know about the Fall of the Gap? Because I watched it a lot of, I still do. Watch a lot of TV, read a lot of books. So I wanted to be knowledgeable because, in closing, about 15 years ago, I remember there was a military social worker, well, there was a civilian social worker that was dealing with a person that had PTSD from a RPG hitting his vehicle and killing a bunch of his friends. And instead of the person asking what RPG is, he assumed that his vehicle was hit by a small car. He lost that veteran, that version, walked the fuck out and never went back.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Robert. And you bring up a great point. And anyone who knows me knows that my mantra is setting boundaries, and setting boundaries is definitely another form of self-care. So thank you for sharing that. And Eddie, you bring up a very good point with burnout versus exploitation. So if you want to speak on that.
Mm-hmm. I think to start, it's at its core remembering that joy is a radical act of resistance to colonial violence. Just being Black and brown and just enjoying your life and showing it and expressing that pisses a lot of the oppressors off. That's one. Two, I think that we have to challenge the idea of burnout because it's not really burnout, it's exploitation. These systems were designed to just take as much as they can from workers as if we're machines. And to date, I don't know one machine that if not turned off and gets rest does not overheat. So I think that even in thinking about this rabbit hole of like expanding consciousness, there are actual CIA manuals that show how to destabilize certain nonprofit groups, how you do that strategically to make sure that this group cannot be successful. And because of the nonprofit industrial complex, the majority of our agencies do this. They don't hire as many people. They quiet hire multiple people for different roles. They put in all of these levels of red tape to get things done. And so you know, I think that you talking about a client who is actively suicidal is a good example, because we, by all like common knowledge, would think that this agency would have more support systems. Why is it that me on my day off or while I'm not on the clock has to sit and probably not even get paid because it's going to be overtime to try and work with somebody when there needs to be other things in place? And so I think, again, it goes back to understanding following the money. How much money does the board make in comparison to everybody else who are actually doing the work, who are making the decisions? So I think that we have to constantly examine our language and our relationship to this entire reality and radically self-accept it. Like if we're thinking about, you know, radical acceptance theory, pushing back against that only causes suffering. It doesn't mean we agree with it, but we can really see it for what it is and say, now, how can I create change for myself on the individual level?
I also wanted to add, like, Eddie, thank you for bringing up burnout versus exploitation, because I am definitely someone who will be like, oh, I'm so burnt out. But then, like, when you put that in the comment, like, the switch immediately went off, like, no, I was fucking exploited at my job that I'm no longer at, because I was in a comfortable situation. They decided, oh, let's just take the rug out from underneath you, even though you're on a team that gets you, supports you, is helping you make whatever goals that we need you to make, blah, 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 bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. They switched me, and then I ended up being micromanaged because of a small discrepancy in encounter logs, because I'm constantly multitasking to make all of my goals with my clients. And ultimately, I ended up having a mental breakdown. And, you know, looking back to that, like, so many times I've asked myself, is it a pattern of me? But it's not a reflection of me. It's the reflection of the system that I'm working within, because they just don't give a shit, and they just don't give a shit about the clients. And it's hard for me because I do give a shit about my clients. I do want to get, you know, the stuff that they need to them. And ultimately, like, what this job did to me, they asked for, you know, professionalism, put in your 4-week notice of resignation. I did exactly that. And the day that I handed it in, they said, thank you for all of your hard work, but today is going to be your last day. Thank you for resigning. And because of that, I am unable to collect unemployment. Fortunately, I'm on Medicaid and I'm able to, you know, get my medications that I need. But I was just like rocked by it, because also the clickiness of it too. Like, I was being bullied by a fucking intern because her supervisor was the program director. And honestly, like, I had no problem talking back, and I spoke back to that fucking program director when she gave me a half-ass compliment. I said, oh, good thing I was loud enough to be heard this time, because that was after she was already calling me into the office for so-called talking too much, and then called me into the office again to tell me I wasn't talking enough in the office. Bitch, pick one. I'm sorry, like, I'm really, like, that shit got me heated. And then, like, as for, like, my identity, I'm a biracial person, and, like, I don't know why I do know why I struggle with just saying that flat out, and it's because of the fact that I am light-skinned. and pass, at least in the eyes of white people. So it's like 29 years of this shit and just working it out. And like that's also a big part of the reason why I got a new therapist, because the therapist that I had before was a white lady who is like 65 years old and is talking to me about her accomplishments. And then whenever I'm like trying to address real trauma and I'm explaining that talking about it works for me, she's just like, let's do a mindfulness activity. All right, we're gonna push that along down the lazy river. Like, no, like therapy is to discuss trauma. That's why I'm here. So yeah, I gave her the silent breakup. I didn't call her back because I'm at a point where like, yeah, I feel rage. It's a different kind of rage. You know, it's a personal internal rage that I know I have so much to fucking offer. And I get, honestly, I feel like I get blockaded by the whiteness. Sorry, my dad is talking in the background. He's talking to the cats, but that's okay. So yeah, like I just needed to get that off.
Thank you for sharing, Ariel. I think a lot of people can resonate with your experiences and kind of just being treated as an object that's there to fulfill duties rather than an actual human employer of the organizations. So you're getting a lot of love on the Zoom, and we're all keeping you in our minds. It pains me that you have internalized all of these things going on at work and kind of, asking yourself, is it me? Is it me? That's, it's really painful to hear. So I hope that this conversation brings you comfort in knowing that you're not alone in what you experience. And it certainly isn't you. It's more so the places of employment. And unfortunately, it's all too common in social work places of employment or field internships. I saw Yael posted in the chat that a lot of social work students are feeling burnt out by the field and the oppressive systems before they even graduate. So it's just very disheartening.
And then also like another thing too is to remember like the people that get to walk away with these degrees, like not everyone should be a social worker, just point blank. And the fact that like with this last employer, they were aware of my mental illness because I'm transparent. I'm not ashamed of it. Like, if anything, I feel like it adds a little extra spice to me. But like the fact that they then used my illness to gaslight me, it's like, do you think like I have a mental illness? I'm not stupid, and fuck you. And I'm sorry for cursing on this, but and these are social workers. These are people with their LCSWs. And I'm just like, wow. And then the second team coordinator that I was switched to in our very first supervision, I was sharing with her something, and she said to me, oh, so you're into macro social work. Bitch, I'm into social work. What the fuck do you mean? Stop dividing it. Because at the end of the day, is there individual choice to it, yes. But also there is a whole lot of outside motherfucking factors here that play into a person's life that we need to account for, that we need to address, that and we need to like just stop dividing it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ariel. Anna agrees with you in the chat. Clinical versus macro is the way social work aligns with oppressive systems. I've heard this from someone else. We can't CBT our way out of oppression.
I think also like what's really important is understanding what enough is for you. Because, and this is where I talk about returning to indigenous frameworks, because for the majority of us, we've been taught that our only value is to produce. And then we subconsciously don't examine how our shadow of scarcity and survival mindset pushes us into, I may have enough, I may make enough money to have a roof over my head, clothes on my back, food in my stomach, and enough money to save and enjoy my life, but I will literally kill myself for an extra $3,000 at a job. I think that COVID should have taught us one thing, which is rest. And the fact that during this time, we saw one of the largest like growth in entrepreneurship from Black and brown people. And how has our government tried to destabilize that by saying, oh, no longer is it $15,000 before you can claim taxes, now it's 600. They're trying to push us back into a workforce that is inherently oppressive. And I think that a lot of us take the bait. Like, yeah, we all want to help our families and do all of these things if we can. But the thing is if we can. It's none of our individual responsibilities to be the savior of our entire bloodline. And I think that we have to challenge that colonial trauma, like at a very deep level. And to like the social work interns, and I think it was Ariel who was talking before. Like I had a very similar experience where my supervisor, she told me to get another profession. She said, you scare white people, you should think of another profession. And essentially, I just want to remind all of y'all before I hop off, because I have a client at 7, that your purpose is not meant to be understood by those it's not meant to serve at all. Do not put in extra labor for a job that does not care about you. I don't even give 2 weeks notice anymore. You're not going to give me 2 weeks notice to fire me. So goodbye, I'm out. Figure it out. Y'all figure it out if I were to die tomorrow. So goodbye. When it comes to these internships, keep in mind that if they are having you do mediocre tasks like organizing a cabinet or getting coffee, that is no longer considered social work academic internship material. It is now considered employee stuff. So you could actually sue them because you're now an employee. So understand your rights, your labor laws, and do not be afraid to throw that at them. And if you're afraid for backlash, this is why within the social profession, we always say, document, document, document. Email those logs over to your personal email, because the first thing that the agency will do is scrub your entire work email. Know how to play the game and play it well. That's all I got to say before I hop off, y'all.
Thank you so much, Eddie. You've had some gems to add into this conversation tonight.
I do think that, Eddie did bring up a good point, especially when it comes to, and it's like the messaging, right, that we receive from so many different places. Like, you have to create this and you have to create that, and you got to help your mom, and you got to take care of your grandma, and you have to do all the things. But it's like, at what point is enough and you draw those lines and the boundaries? Because like my parents were immigrants, and so they didn't have wealth and houses and all the things. Like, they're trying to do that. And so, like, yeah, would it be nice if they could have something to hand down to me? Sure. But I'm going to do the best that I can to set up my kids to have whatever they can have. But then I expect them to, like, even if it's moved the needle a little bit forward, but I'm not going to kill myself to own 12 houses and be a multimillionaire to put everybody and my nieces and everybody through college. I just can't do that. I'm single-handedly, you can't do all of that alone. And nobody should have that kind of pressure. It's just not fair.
Definitely. I think that relates back to our conversation about staying true to yourself. And I think Fatimata spoke on this, like knowing yourself at the end of the day and what you want and your goals and how that aligns with your future. Not so much getting wrapped up in what you see as the norm in society or whatnot. Well, thank you all for a great conversation. I do want to end on more of a positive note. So I'm going to ask our last question for the night. What are the moments of joy that you experience while advocating?
I always have this one case, well, actually I have several, but this one case was very impactful on me as one of my proudest moments as a clinician, where I first started working with this particular client. He was 100% non-service connected. And he was a Marine from the Korean War. So you can imagine him having injuries not being documented and all his positions being dead. And he was experiencing some memory loss. But the one thing he was crystal clear on was the day he was injured, what he was doing, his squad, and the whole 9 yards. So taking that, I let him take the lead and writing down his experience and his caregiver / girlfriend and myself and DAV, Disabled American Veterans. By the time I finished about 6 months later, he was 100% service connected and he had 8 in attendance. He was in his upper 80s. He had a couple of tumbles at the VA. So therefore they couldn't deny that either. And so he was very grateful. What he wanted to do, I may have said this before in a previous group, is that he wanted to take me, my wife, and my daughter to Morton Steakhouse, his treat. Now, for those of you not familiar with Morton Steakhouse, that is one of the most expensive steakhouses in the country. Of course, I said no. That I already got a salary, and your thank you is more than enough.
That's amazing, just to see the impact that you had connecting him to clients, to communities.
I just wanted to add to that. For me, it's really the little wins, like knowing that you've impacted someone's life because of something that you need, the advocacy. I had a client who spent so many years in and out of a rehabilitation facility and then to a nursing home, who was potentially going to lose their spot at their residential group home. And it took us years and years of fighting back and forth involving lawyers and agency CEOs, CFOs. But eventually the person was able to get their places back, like in their group home, although they were not physically fit to be in that place. So for me, it's really like the little wins, like all your work like coming to a fruition.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Fatimata.
Of course.
Mary shared in the chat that watching someone else take the torch gives her joy. Anna shared connecting with the people I do work with outside of work, getting dinner, going for a hike, building connection outside of advocacy is important too. Absolutely, relationships are very crucial to this work and kind of getting our feet indoors that we may not necessarily always have been welcomed in. One of the actions, I'll call it, that brings me joy in activism is when I'm explaining the item or the policy that I'm advocating for to someone who may have been opposed to it or, you know, doesn't really know too much about it, and kind of seeing it click in their head. That's the little piece that brings me joy, and that kind of keeps motivating me to do the work. Just knowing how many people I can kind of get those wheels turning for.
I had a similar experience, Olivia, and that ties very nicely back to what Fatimata said about counting the small things, because even if it's just one person, you know what I'm saying? Like, you've made an impact. It reminds me of that. It was like a kid walking down a beach and throws like the crab back in the water. It's like, I made an impact on that one crab. There's a whole beach, but you know, you touch somebody. When I was at a senior center talking to them about like the city council person for the district that where my daughter's school is, and this gentleman was telling me, oh, he doesn't believe in politics and all this stuff. So we were talking about different things that's going on in the district. And at the end of the conversation, he was like, you know, I'm gonna go look up this Lincoln wrestler guy because I like you. And I think that, you know, you have some good things that you're talking about. And so if you work for him, then he must be a good guy, because I don't think that you'll be working for somebody who's like, you know, all these other politicians. And that made me feel good. And I literally, like, I think about that man almost every day. It's like so weird, but I do, because it made me feel so good. And I've never had anybody kind of like say something like that. Like, you may see certain things click and people may make associations and stuff like that, but to actually hear them verbalize it was like so meaningful to me. And so I literally think about that man every day, and I'm gonna go back to that senior center and go visit him.
Thank you for sharing, Alicia. I think we're all kind of recognizing that these small parts of activism is what keeps us going in this work.
Can I just offer something? So I am really into Adrienne Maree Brown. I'm reading her book, their book, Emergent Strategy. I've read it several times, but they talk about small is good. One of the principles of emergent strategy, small is good, small is all. So when we talk about, a lot of times when we say, well, it's just a small thing, the small things, like, they ripple out. So the pebble that is thrown right on the sand into the water, that creates a ripple, then that creates a further ripple, and that creates a further ripple, and it just ripples out, right? So that's what keeps me going. And that's, to me, this conversation is just small, right? Those small shifts are powerful. And a lot of times we think it has to be really big, you know, but the small shifts are powerful. This is Adrienne Maree Brown, Emergent Strategy. I can write it in the chat also.
Slightly off topic, but I have a question for the people remaining in the group. I am getting ready to take my licensure exam for the third time, and I'm hoping the third time's a charm. Anyone have any strategies to make sure that the third time will be the last time I take this damn test?
Any tips or tricks for Robert? I haven't personally taken the exam, but I have heard that I think there's a YouTube channel or a test prep app that's helpful. Practice tests. And we wish you good luck, Robert. Third time is the charm.
I have a suggestion, Robert. I think one of just ties sort of in well to what we talked about is I took my exam last year, and what my supervisor told me is to go into this test thinking like a white cis male. That this test was created in that way for us to think that way. It never reflects on your actual skills as an amazing social worker, as what you've shared about your patient and the hard work that you put into those patients. Sadly, it's never going to reflect on what it is to be a social worker in the field. And that's something that what my supervisor told me a few years back when I first took it.
Unfortunately, yeah, that is a great piece of advice. Thank you so much, Yael. All right, well, I think that wraps up our town hall for tonight on finding and sustaining joy in social work activism. Thank you all so much for joining us. We had a really great conversation. We don't know just yet on the next date. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nell, but I am going to put our website in the chat right now to stay updated. As soon as we do have a date, we will update our website and post it on social media. And I'll put our social media handle in the chat. We are NASW NYS on all of our platforms, and you can keep up to date with all of our events that are happening. Thank you all so much for a great conversation tonight.
Thank you.